Welcome to the Recommended Daily Value Podcast, your daily dose into the health and wellness world.
Welcome back to the Recommended Daily Value Podcast, where we dive into everything health, fitness, and nutrition related 5 days a week in 5 minutes or less. This podcast is brought to you by Umzu, and I'm your host, Tyler Woodward. If you're not already, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button, because today we've got our weekly book review. And the book of the week is The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel Van Der Kolk. If you're not aware, the book is predominantly about trauma, from car accidents to veterans to child abuse victims. Bessel does a great job of both relaying his own experiences working with trauma patients and discussing the science behind the subject. Admittedly, I was very apprehensive about reading this book, as I'd been recommended it a few times, and personally, I think the word trauma is very overused today by many people that haven't really experienced true trauma. Also, I'm not quite sure how to abbreviate his last name, so I'm just going to refer to him as Bessel as if we were friends. That being said, Bessel did a phenomenal job with this book, and I definitely recommend it if this is something that interests you. As a forewarning, I'm going to be sharing a lot of quotes because he's a very talented writer, and I think his words are much more depth than mine would be for this topic. First, I wanted to share a few passages that I found very profound, and I don't want to misconstrue his book as it's 99% about his findings with working with PTSD patients, but he also does air some grievances with the drug revolution and pharmaceutical industry, which I personally can relate to and gravitate to. Quote unquote, before the late 19th century, doctors classified illnesses according to their surface manifestations, like fevers, pustules, which was not unreasonable, given that they had little else to go on. This changed when scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch discovered that many diseases were caused by bacteria that were invisible to the naked eye. Medicine then was transformed by its attempts to discover ways to get rid of these organisms rather than just treating the boils and fevers that they caused. With DSM-5, which stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, Edition 5, psychiatry firmly regressed to early 19th century medical practice. Despite the fact we know the origin of many of the problems it identifies, its diagnoses describe surface phenomena that completely ignore the underlying causes. Even before DSM-5 was released, the American Journal of Psychiatry published the results of validity tests of various new diagnoses, which indicated that the DSM-5 largely lacks what in the world of science is known as reliability, the ability to produce consistent, replicable results. In other words, it lacks scientific validity. And here's one more passage. The drug revolution that started out with so much promise may in the end have done as much harm as good. The theory that mental illness is primarily caused by chemical imbalances in the brain that can be corrected by specific drugs has become broadly accepted by the media and the public as well as by the medical profession. In many places, drugs have displaced therapy and enabled patients to suppress their problems without addressing the underlying issues. Antidepressants can make all the difference in the world in helping with day-to-day functioning. And if it comes to a choice between taking a sleeping pill and drinking yourself into a stupor every night to get a few hours of sleep, there's no question which is preferable. For people who are exhausted from trying to make it on their own through yoga classes, workout routines, or simply toughing it out, medications often can bring life-saving relief. The SSRIs can be very helpful in making traumatized people less enslaved by their emotions, but they should only be considered adjuncts in their overall treatment. Now to the Spark Notes. There's a lot of things I could cover here, but here are some of the things I found most interesting. First, trauma patients are quite literally stuck in their trauma. They're frequently plagued by flashbacks to their traumatic event that brings them right back to the scene of the crime, so to speak. While they might be sitting in their living room, in their mind they are at war or being raped or beaten back in the situation which traumatized them in the first place. Bessel states, quote unquote, whether the trauma had occurred 10 years in the past or more than 40, my patients could not bridge the gap between wartime experiences and their current lives. Somehow, the very event that had caused them so much pain had also become their sole source of meaning. They felt fully alive only when they were revisiting their traumatic past. Which is just a hauntingly beautiful line, so much so that I'm going to say it again. Somehow, the very event that had caused them so much pain had also become their sole source of meaning. Interestingly, it turns out that during these flashbacks, this area of the brain called the Broca's area, which is one of the speech centers of the brain, is basically turned off. This area is often affected in stroke patients, and without a functioning Broca's area, you cannot put your thoughts and feelings into words, which explains why, at least in part, victims of trauma have such difficulty expressing what happened to them. He states, quote unquote, I'm continually impressed by how difficult it is for people who have gone through the unspeakable to convey the essence of their experience. And it turns out you don't need one big traumatic event to occur to be traumatized. Quote unquote, over the years, our research team has repeatedly found that chronic emotional abuse and neglect can be just as devastating as physical abuse and sexual molestation. But one of the most insane characteristics of trauma, though, has to be this